Mr. Leibler, your name is Jeremy Leibler.
Yes.
What is your occupation?
I am a partner at Leibler, practicing in mergers and acquisitions.
You've made a statement dated 4th of May 2026.
Yes.
Are the contents of that statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
The document ID for the statement is stat.899.0052.0001, and I tender Mr. Leibler's statement.
Yes, Mr. Leibler's statement will be Exhibit 1.50.
Mr. Leibler, you're a Jewish Australian living with your family in Melbourne.
Yes.
Like many Jewish Australians, your family history was afflicted by the events of the Holocaust, is that right?
Yes.
Would you care to describe that family history in a potted way?
Sure. Well, my mother's family came from Czechoslovakia, and they arrived in Australia as refugees after the war. Two of my mother's sisters survived Auschwitz. They were child survivors, and they survived masquerading as twins. They were given extra rations and experimented on by the notorious Mengele. She was born in 1945, just at the very end of the war in hiding, and then they came to Australia. She lost siblings that she had yet to meet, and many other members of the extended family were murdered in the Holocaust. On my father's side, they arrived on the last boat out of Belgium just before the war, when Jews were still allowed to leave, and those that arrived built their life here in Australia before the war, but at least on one set of my father's grandparents were murdered, and many members of their extended family as well.
You yourself grew up in Melbourne, is that right?
Yes.
Could you describe your childhood in Melbourne, and in particular, did you experience anti-Semitism in Melbourne growing up?
My childhood was blessed. I mean, I grew up in, and we were a very traditional, modern Orthodox Jewish family. I attended a Jewish day school. I never grew up with a sort of conscious sense of fear from being Jewish. I was very well aware of the history, Jewish history. We would have every Shabbat meal with my aunts. There were survivors everywhere in the community. It was very common for people to have the tattoo on their arm. And I very rarely experienced anti-Semitism. I attended university and I wore a yarmulke. I would wear a yarmulke to the football. I started my working life doing clerkships at law firms, being very openly Jewish. And I other than the occasional sort of comment here or there, I very rarely experienced anti-Semitism. I think in many ways the environment in which I grew up was sort of based on, even if it wasn't said, it was understood that we were incredibly lucky and grateful to be in this country. That didn't just afford our family and the Jewish community safety, but opportunity, and the Australian fair go is the best way I could describe it. It was a visceral thought and understanding at the table. It was always there, and there was a sense that in return for that, I wouldn't even describe it as a duty, but a desire to give back to our community, to Australia, but also in particular to other people who knew what it meant to be sort of the other. And that was a feature of my upbringing.
And you've continued to live and work based in Melbourne?
Yes, for most of my working life. After I spent a gap year in Israel after high school, and then also after I got married, I spent 6 months working in a law firm in Israel as well before I started what was then called articles.
You've referred in your statement in paragraph 5 to the three lenses that you describe your experience through. Would you describe those lenses?
Well, I guess my my experiences, certainly since the 7th of October, but from well before, were first and foremost as a father. I have 4 children. Today, the oldest is about to turn 20, and I have a 16-year-old, and I have identical twin 13-year-old boys. And so, like most of the Jewish community, I've experienced both 7th of October and this rise in anti-Semitism through their eyes. As a Jewish leader, as President of the Zionist Federation of Australia, this will be my 8th year in that role. The Zionist Federation is the elected representative roof body of the Jewish community. And, you know, there was a very dramatic shift in the level of responsibility and burden after the 7th of October, where I was sort of thrust into this position where I was representing, you know, really a traumatised community. And then thirdly, as a partner at Arnold Bloch Leibler, where while my own practice is mergers and acquisitions, after the 7th of October, very quickly the phone was really ringing off the hook from Jewish Australians who had been subjected to anti-Semitism from all walks of life.
Seems fair to say that your engagement with members of the Jewish community is very broad and frequent, having regard to your roles as partner of the law firm and as president of the Zionist Federation. Is that right?
Absolutely.
You've said in your statement that your experience of anti-Semitism is structured around what you refer to as 2 covenants. Would you care to explain what you mean by that?
Well, the first covenant I referred to a little bit earlier is this basic belief that Australia has given my family and my community enormous opportunity and love with open arms. And in return, and as part of that covenant, it's our responsibility to give back. And I feel that really defined much of our family life. My father dedicated and continues to dedicate decades of his life to Indigenous causes. Arnold Bloch Leibler, which he founded together with Arnold Bloch, has for many years since its inception, has a very significant public interest law practice that certainly over the 20 years prior to the 7th of October was primarily focused on Indigenous communities, Sudanese communities, human rights, dealing with racism in all its forms. The second covenant is Israel. And it is, in a sense, notwithstanding how our sense of gratitude and belonging here in Australia, the shadow of the Holocaust and our personal and family experiences in the Holocaust, and frankly an understanding of Jewish history, created this understanding and sense that the Jewish people, it was not sustainable for Jewish people to live as a minority and as defenseless people. And so the second covenant really is the critical role that Israel plays in our Jewish identity. And that role is not just as a security backstop. That is a part of it, particularly post-Holocaust. But Israel, really, the modern state of Israel today reflected a return of the Jewish people after 2,000 years of exile, of a history being exiled from country to country, after experiencing pogroms, which culminated in the Holocaust. That finally there would be a place to go, but not just in the negative, that Israel, the modern state of Israel, represented and indeed is the vehicle through which Jewish people can fulfill their destiny. And that that vehicle is there even if you're not living there. And that is, I think, the complex nature of the Jewish identity of someone living outside of Israel.
You make the powerful point, if I can put it that way, Mr. Leibler, in paragraph 14, to this effect, that this second covenant that you refer to was never about endorsing any particular Israeli government or policy. It was about something more fundamental, the recognition that Jewish collective survival required sovereignty. Is that the way you see the basal principle of Zionism?
Absolutely. I mean, for many people, a core part of that covenant is disagreeing with the Israeli government of the day. That is the nature of Jewish debate around the dinner table. The role that Israel plays in the Jewish identity of diaspora Jews, in part, is that struggle with Israel. That is the nature of our identity. Israel's not perfect. No country is perfect. Part really of what Zionism is, which is really the basic belief that Jewish people have a right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. But part of the expression of Zionism is what we call, is broadly referred to as tikkun olam, which is perfecting the world, which is our vehicle for improving the world, contributing to the world, is to contribute to Israel. And that involves struggling with it, dealing with its deficiencies, celebrating its wins, mourning its losses. That is the nature of Jewish identity in the diaspora, and in part is why the 7th of October was such a traumatic experience for not just Israeli Jews who were directly impacted by it, but for diaspora Jewry as well.
You describe in your statement the shattering effect of events in early October 2023. The Commission has heard from very many witnesses over the last few days who describe October 2023 for Jewish Australians as a real turning point. Is that also your perspective?
Yes, it was certainly a turning point, a very dramatic turning point. And if I can put it this way, anti-Semitism didn't begin on the 7th of October 2023. And I know this in part because it was only a few months before that in my capacity as president of the Zionist Federation, we commissioned an independent survey into the experiences of Jewish students on campuses, because I was receiving anecdotal phone calls every week from Jewish students. And I would go and meet with the universities, with the chancellors and vice chancellors, and they would say, well, that's terrible, but we don't have a problem here. So we thought, let's go out and get the data. And the data showed a very, very significant cases of anti-Semitism. I don't recall the statistics specifically, but I think one of the headlines were over 80% of Jewish students felt the need to hide their Jewish identity on campus, and that was before the 7th of October. But what I would say fundamentally shifted on the 7th of October was the normalisation of anti-Semitism within mainstream society, whereby suddenly rhetoric, commentary, positions taken that would have been completely unacceptable before the 7th of October had become normalised and acceptable. And I think that is what also, in addition to the actual rise in anti-Semitism, the failure of leaders in all parts of society to call that out after the 7th of October together while we were experiencing the trauma of what had happened on the 7th of October, that really created this absence of psychological safety. Even before the physical acts of violence had started, very soon after the 7th of October, we had this psychological absence of safety that even when there was anti-Semitism when I was growing up, we never felt it in that way, because we felt that we had the support of our leaders and of mainstream society.
You refer in particular to the protests in the forecourt of the Sydney Opera House on about the 9th of October. And I understand you were in Melbourne at the time, but what do you remember seeing and hearing from that occasion?
Well, I remember very clearly before these protests occurred, and seeing the decision and images of Australian, these sites like the Opera House being lit up in blue and white in solidarity, and that was incredibly meaningful, and I think provided a lot of comfort for the Jewish community that Australia and our leaders understood how this, not just in a bilateral relationship sense, Australia giving support to Israel, but as a sign also to the Jewish community that Australia understood the impact that this had on us. And when those images hit our phones and TV screens, I think it took some time to process that this was actually really happening. And I recall, I think it was a day or so later, I really from the 7th of October, I was in a very unprepared way thrust into the spotlight in the media every day. The media couldn't get a hold of anyone in Israel for days. It was chaos, and so they would turn to the community here to find out what was happening. And so I had done a lot of media, and I recall receiving a phone call from my aunt, Eva, who is still alive today. She's in her early 90s, and she had survived Auschwitz. She was one of the two aunts that I have. And she said to me at the time, she called, she goes, I saw your interview on Channel 9, and it was a bit of I didn't even realise it at the time, but it was a combative interview. I don't know how it could have been a combative interview 2 days after the 7th of October, but it was. She said, I want to just thank you for speaking out. But I have to tell you, I never thought that the day would come that I would see Australians chanting, and at the time, we understood the words to have been used were gas the Jews, and since I understand it was where are the Jews or F the Jews, but I'm not sure that really makes too much of a difference. She said, I just never thought that I would see this in Australia that gave us everything. And I think for her, I think she said something to the effect of, she saw this as almost like the beginning of or a call for a pogrom. That is what her reference point was from her childhood. This is how she saw it begin. And I think that left a mark on me, both this bizarre concept of a Holocaust survivor aunt calling me to thank me, and just hearing and seeing the sense of betrayal in her voice. That's something I won't forget.
You make the point that the 9 October protests were carried out before Israel had mounted any significant military response to the Hamas attack. And that reflects, does it, an understanding on your part about the political as opposed to that creates your understanding of that 9 October protest as particularly offensive and disturbing. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that protest on the 9th of October in many ways, it sort of represented what was to come. We didn't appreciate it at the time, but it was the first shattering of those two covenants all at once, because it was the shattering of our physical and psychological sense of safety in this country. How on earth could it be that Australians were chanting F the Jews or where are the Jews? They were still recovering bodies in the kibbutzim in southern Israel. I have a nephew of mine who was called up, my brother lives in Israel, who was called to reserves, that spent 10 days after the 7th of October recovering the bodies from the various kibbutzim. They couldn't differentiate half the time between the civilians, the terrorists, or identify many of the victims because of the barbarity of what took place on that day. And so, and this is not unique to me. This is, almost every member of the Jewish community would have friends or family in Israel. And as we were experiencing this personal and collective trauma, we see fellow Australians chanting calls for our demise. And we also see, before Israel had responded, before Israel had done anything, and it was a sign of what was to come, and what was the response that we at least saw? The police instructed the Jewish community not to attend the Opera House. It wouldn't be safe. And we saw that failure in leadership, not always intentional, and I don't believe in that case intentional, but misguided. We saw this pattern. We saw it when Jewish students were fearful to attend campus and sit their exams. They were told, it's okay, you can sit your exams at home. When there were intimidating encampments on campuses and Jewish students did not feel safe going to lectures, they were told, it's okay, we'll create a safe room for you. Well-intentioned, but the message that was received by those students and by the Jewish community is that we either can't or we are not prepared to take the necessary steps to keep you safe and protect you.
Mr. Leibler, you've also, in your statement, attached a lengthy annexure that reproduces page after page of anti-Semitic abuse directed at you by email and by social media, which you say in your statement was additional to threatening and obscene voicemail messages that you've received. Has that sort of thing accompanied the whole of your time as president of the Zionist Federation?
To some degree, but the scale and volume of it dramatically shifted after the 7th of October. And I would say also, before the 7th of October, it was almost always anonymous accounts, people under fake names or bots. And then suddenly, within a very short period of time, it was normalised, it was acceptable for people that at least at some point in time played a role in parts of society, former journalists, individuals that at points in time had standing, suddenly had the social license to attack and torment, yes, me as a Jewish leader, but this was not just directed to me as a Jewish leader. As I'm sure the Commission has heard, almost anyone that is openly Jewish on social media is a recipient. And what we'd observe is, this sort of the horseshoe effect. It would be the extreme left and the extreme right, and the only issue they could agree upon was how they felt about Jews, or as they would often use as a proxy, Zionists.
The online abuse has included the use of photographs of your family and of your children.
Yeah, yes, and that was the subject of one of the police complaints. Sometimes these things happen quickly but slowly, and it takes you a minute to realise, because the abuse is so constant and has no correlation to what you would put out. I could post a picture of a beautiful sunset and I'd be called a genocide supporter, child killer. And I think when I saw that this individual, and it was obsessively posting pictures of my family and my children, my first reaction was to think, oh, how stupid am I? Because of course those pictures were sourced from an article that appeared in the Australian Jewish News after I'd assumed my role as president of the Zionist Federation in 2018 to, who is Jeremy, and here's his family and these are their interests, get to know the community. And I remember at the time, at that moment, I thought back that the journalist at the time said, are you happy for these photos to be on the website? And I didn't even understand the context in which he was asking the question. It never occurred to me that someone would seek to use pictures of my children, my young children, particularly then, they were very young, as a means to target me because of my role as a Jewish leader, or frankly because I am Jewish.
No doubt, and as you say in your statement, your children became aware of this abuse of you and use of their images against them at some level. What was the effect on your family?
Well, I think it would have been impossible not to, but my children, they really saw everything. I mean, firstly, I went from being a very present father that knew what their homework was and what books they were reading and what the topic of their assignment was, to being both physically and certainly mentally not very present. And certainly the older two, my daughter saw the threats and the death threats and the abuse on social media. At one point, my middle son, who's now 16, but would have been around 14 at the time, or 13 or 14, and he's got a keen interest in history and in politics, did from a young age, and he said to me, he actually didn't say this with fear, it was clinical, it was rational. He said, "Dad, I don't understand. Why aren't we leaving?" Like to him, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, I don't understand. Like, just we're learning the lead up to World War II at school at the moment. Like, this is, it is so clear. It was so plainly obvious to him that this was the beginning of something that, well, to him it felt irreversible. That wasn't my view, and it's not my view. But it was incredibly confronting to have 13 or 14-year-olds make that observation.
You referred to another instance with your children that particularly affected you, and it was a conversation with your children on a walk earlier this year, and it gave rise to what you've said in your statement is the most important thing you can tell the Commission. Would you like to address that, please?
Yeah, so this happened, I think, sometime after Bondi, and I think I was going for a walk on a Saturday afternoon with my youngest twin boys, and one of them, we live close to Caulfield Junior College, a state school in the area, and we were walking past, and this is an area they walk past all the time, and he sort of suddenly, turned to us and said, "Dad," it's like he got confused for a minute, and he was like, "Dad, I don't understand. Why are the fences so low? Where are the guards? Why, it's got a little fence that the kids often would jump over to go and play football on a weekend." And it's like he'd forgotten where he was. And then he said, oh, he caught himself, and he said, I forgot. I forgot. It's not a Jewish school, so they don't need the fences and the guard. And I think in many ways, I think hearing him make that observation, it sort of at its core, I think, reflects the impact on most members of the Jewish community. And that is, what has changed is not that there was no anti-Semitism and suddenly that there is, but for my 13-year-old son to have now normalised this situation that Jewish schools, Jewish children need high fences and guards and security and to be protected, but other children don't, and other schools don't, and that is normal. That isn't something he learned from me. He didn't learn that at home. It's not how I grew up. And ultimately, it's painful not just as a father, it's painful as an Australian, because this impacts the very nature of this country. It's not how I grew up. It's not how I want anyone's children to grow up, Jewish or not Jewish. And it feels like it happened very quickly. It doesn't feel irreversible to me, but I also don't know. I don't see an immediate pathway to addressing it.
One section of your statement details the work that you've undertaken and that Arnold Bloch Leibler has undertaken as a firm for numerous pro bono clients focusing on the time since October 2023, would you provide a brief description of that work?
So we saw, my phone was ringing off the hook after the 7th of October, and it was almost always from traumatised members of the community asking for help because of experience of anti-Semitism, isolation, exclusion, discrimination. And what became very clear and bizarre at the same time very quickly was, this was not limited to one part of society. This was across, it was particularly bad within the arts, within progressive spaces, within academia, but it was everywhere. It wasn't only there. And the range of clients were from Jewish artists who were being cancelled, who were having venues cancelled, often, by the way, not because the venue ideologically wanted to. Often the cancellation would be accompanied by, I'm so sorry, but I've been told that there's going to be a BDS boycott campaign if we allow you to perform, and we're a small business and we just can't afford to be attacked online. But from artists who, their livelihood, their income was being impacted. Some were way too terrified to speak out. Some were incredibly brave and did so, and I understand will speak to the Commission. But also to others, to families who were second generation Holocaust survivor families whose parents came here with absolutely nothing and built incredibly successful businesses. And they, together with their children, were heavily involved in philanthropy. These are families who built, particularly in Victoria, who effectively built the arts sector in Victoria off the back of their generosity. And I observed that, one would think that, those who are successful and have resources, they can withstand this sort of pressure and exclusion. But in many ways, I think they were even more traumatised. And that's because their covenant, not dissimilar, that was shattered, was that their success, their contribution to this country bought them a seat at the table. Not with special treatment, but as an equal. And they discovered after the 7th of October very quickly that that seat was conditional, and it was conditional on them rejecting a core part of their Jewish identity. That being their Zionism, their belief in the right of Jewish people to have their own homeland. There were artists whose entire careers were built off the back of their generosity, who distanced themselves, forget picking up the phone to see how they are, that were forced or chose to come out publicly accusing them of being genocide supporters. And again, this was in the weeks after the 7th of October. This was very early that it started, and it continued and got worse. And ultimately, I think we just saw this play out very slowly, in part as a product of intimidation from activists and groups. But I think it clearly revealed something that sat under the surface, that may have stayed under the surface for a very long time, were it not for this normalisation of anti-Semitism at the dinner table.
Your statement refers to in excess of 100 pro bono clients across numerous professions and walks of life. Is the character of the anti-Semitism that those clients have experienced, has that changed to your perception after October 2023 or in the last few years?
Well, yes, it has, because in effect, the war that followed Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October and the obsessive demonization of Israel, as distinct from criticisms of the Israeli government of the day, has effectively given this social license And what has played out, both that I have experienced personally, that I observed many of these clients and many of the members of the Jewish community experience, is the word Zionist being used as a proxy for Jew. It's still not entirely, although we've seen instances of it, acceptable to call someone a dirty Jew, certainly in main polite society, but it is today a dirty Zionist or a baby killer. And that accusation is thrown by virtue of that person being a Zionist, which the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community in Australia is. And that is the manifestation of anti-Semitism that I have predominantly seen play out. Yes, we have anti-Semitism on the far right, but I think many people in the community feel, well, at least when it comes in the far right in the form of a swastika and a Heil Hitler, it's very clear of what they're saying and where they're coming from. But certainly at the beginning, it was done under this veneer of anti-Zionism.
Your statement also addresses, Mr. Leibler, your views in respect of the failure of governments to address the surge of anti-Semitism in the last few years. Can I draw your attention to your statement of paragraphs 55 to 57 in particular, and could you address that topic briefly, please? In other words, what do you regard the core failures to be, and what, in your view, could or should have been done?
First, I would say that I believe that it is possible that we could have had every anti-Semitic act that we've experienced since the 7th of October, both the violent ones that has resulted in death and injury, as well as the ones, on social media and manifested in the workplace. The Jewish community could have experienced those events, and they would have been traumatic and confronting. But had we had clear moral leadership, both at government and in other parts of society, the impact on the Jewish community, the psychological sense of safety, this critical mass of people seriously considering leaving Australia to go to a country that is at war, where clearly their physical safety is not more secure in Israel than in Australia, but their psychological safety is. Because the failure of our leadership to call out this demonisation, this obsessive demonisation and delegitimization of Israel, created that social license that I spoke about earlier, that could be directed at Jews under the cover of being Zionists. I don't believe that the government, anyone in the government, is motivated by anti-Semitism or is anti-Semitic. I know that to be true. And I believe that in the government, every single elected member of government is genuinely in shock and in despair at the rise of anti-Semitism. But there were decisions made along the way not to speak out, to take the middle path. We won't rock the boat in relation to this issue. We've said something once. Yes, I've said once that is a violent call. I don't have to say it again. When we had an education minister that refused to say whether or not he thought globalise the Intifada was a violent call, that I think the remark initially was, it depends on the context. That sends a message to the Jewish community. It also sends a message to those chanting globalise the Intifada. Now, to his credit, he did walk back those words. But too often, our leaders failed to stand up and make it very clear that they had the Jewish community's back. And I think it took until Bondi for there to be some reality check, some sort of recognition that things have gone too far in this country. We have let the rhetoric get out of control. And there's a lot of discussion, and these are important discussions that should be had around law reform, about hate speech, and those are important issues that I hope are addressed and looked at as part of this commission. But I can tell you there is a lot that can be done before doing any of those things by simply having leaders at all levels demonstrate the moral clarity to say, no, this is not acceptable behaviour. Because at least it will push, it will not eradicate it, but it will push this modern manifestation of this age-old hatred back where it belongs, on the fringes. Because at the moment, it's sitting front and centre.
Mr. Leibler, can I ask you this? You talk about the delegitimisation of Israel, and as I understand it, for you, that connotes the denial of the right of Israel to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people. And you talk about the excessive criticism of Israel. And I don't want this Royal Commission to try and solve the Middle East, Mr. Leibler. And I appreciate that there are views on both sides about the pursuit of the war in Gaza by the current administration. But can you appreciate there is a difficult line between what you describe as delegitimising Israel and the views that may be conscientiously held by non-Jewish Australians of goodwill who are trenchantly critical of actions of Israel, even against the Hamas attack?
Well, there are many of Jewish Australians that are also highly critical of the current Israeli government. I have been publicly, as president of the Zionist Federation, critical of certain actions of the Israeli government, or various Israeli governments over the last 8 years. I don't believe that it is difficult to draw the line. I believe that there are many that have an agenda to make it very difficult in order to blur the lines. And I'll tell you why I don't think it's difficult. We've had many wars. You know, we've had the war in Afghanistan, we've had the Iraq war, we've had protests. I remember when I was starting out as a young lawyer, I think it must have been during the Iraq war, under John Howard. I remember the protests through the city. I don't ever recall Chance saying death, death to the American armed forces, or the Australian armed forces for that matter. I don't recall anyone suggesting we should boycott American businesses. I don't recall ever, you know, there are many people today that are not massive admirers of Donald Trump. I have not heard anyone suggest that America should be dismantled and cease to exist, or that has no legitimacy. And so I look at this rather in simple terms. It is perfectly acceptable to criticise policies of the Israeli government. It is perfectly acceptable to criticise Israel's conduct of the war. It is not legitimate, it is not acceptable, and it does cross the line to describe the Jewish right to self-determination as something that is inherently evil or immoral. That our identity, the core of who we are, that defines us, is evil, because the logical extension of that is that we are evil. And this idea that Zionism, the state of Israel, it's a evil and racist endeavour. We're colonizers. We are white settler colonialist, or it is a conscious choice to choose the terms that today are the worst possible insult you can throw at anyone. And we know where this is very familiar to us, because when it was the worst insult was to be a communist, the Jews were communists. When it was the worst insult for Jews to be capitalists, we were capitalists, sometimes simultaneously, right? When we were racially inferior, the Nazis, would accuse us of racial inferiority. There is nothing new to this. And so I don't accept. We manage in every single other conflict, on every other difficult, complex issue, to differentiate our criticisms of a democratic government to the people, their identity and their existence. Why can't we here? Israelis do it all the time. They're protesting on every different sort of issue, hundreds of thousands of them on the streets of Tel Aviv. They manage to criticise their government, in some cases, far stronger than we do here. But they don't undermine the legitimacy of the state itself or their identity.
Mr. Leibler, towards the end of your statement, you identify, I think, a much more recent shift, which you see as, I think, something of a positive development this year. And could you explain that part of your statement? It's about paragraph 60 and 61.
Well, after Bondi, the Prime Minister recommended to the Governor-General to extend an invitation to President Herzog. The President of Israel, President Herzog, he's not a partisan politician. He is a sort of a figurehead akin to the Governor-General here, to visit Australia, to bring comfort to Australia after the horrors of Bondi, and to the Jewish community, of course. And that visit for the Jewish community was incredibly important. And it wasn't just important because it was a unique event to have the President of the State of Israel be here and to bring comfort to the victims and survivors of Bondi, but implicit in making that invitation and in the way in which the government hosted the President while he was here, they actually modelled precisely what I described. It is no secret that the Australian government has many disagreements on policy and foreign policy with the current government of Israel. What it modelled was that it could recognise that Israel is a democratic ally. Yes, there are some real disagreements on certain issues with the government, but by extending the invitation, it recognised the role that the State of Israel plays in the identity of Jewish Australians and the connection to Bondi, and it did so without making any changes to its foreign policy. It did so without shifting anything politically. And you know what? As everyone will know, there were lots of protests on the streets. But the reaction of the Jewish community to those protests, and I was in Sydney at the event at the ICC with 8,000 people, when at the end of the event the police came in and said, look everyone, everything's okay, but we're just locking you down for about 45 minutes because there are very, very serious protests and we need to do this to provide for your safety. It was a very different reaction from the Jewish community because it was very clear that our leaders had our back. The Prime Minister did not shy away from this visit. He proceeded with it in the face of these protests. The protests occurred. Protests should be able to occur. We're in a free country. They shouldn't be violent, but they should occur. Free expression is critically important. I will fight for their right to protest, even if I disagree with them. But the fact that our leaders stood by that visit and the symbolism of it, that shifted the psychological safety and well-being of the Jewish community. And I believe is a model for how others can do so on similar subjects, even if they're not state visits.
Mr. Leibler, I don't have any further questions. Thank you very much for your attendance today.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Leibler.